Welcome to the deep dive. You know how we love to take complex topics, peel back the layers, and find those surprising insights, the ones that really change how you see things. Today, we're tackling something critical. It impacts millions globally, but, well, for far too long, it's been shrouded in a real lack of solid information. We're talking about using medicines during pregnancy and breastfeeding.
Exactly. For decades, these populations were largely just excluded from clinical trials, almost automatically. Think about that. A huge group of people, often needing medication, but operating without good data on safety or effectiveness for them or their babies.
Right. A huge knowledge gap.
A massive one. So our mission today is really to unpack this crucial shift that's happening right now. It's driven by new global guidelines, aiming to finally put evidence-based decisions where they need to be, into the hands of pregnant and breastfeeding individuals and their doctors. We'll look at the history of this huge blind spot, the changes now, and what it all means for health choices.
Okay, let's get into it. Imagine needing medicine during pregnancy or while breastfeeding, but your doctor basically has to guess. They're guessing the right dose, the potential side effects, because the data just isn't there. That's been the reality for way too long. But things are finally changing, and it feels like a huge step for public health.
It really is.
To understand how big a deal this is, we need to look back a bit. Why were pregnant and breastfeeding people left out of these vital studies?
Well, it largely stems from a very real, very tragic historical event.
Yeah.
That led to a protective approach, which, well, ultimately turned out to be detrimental. The key example is the thalidomide tragedy back in the 1960s. This drug, given for morning sickness, caused severe birth defects, thousands of children worldwide.
It's devastating.
Absolutely, and it rightfully led to much stricter regulations. For instance, the U.S. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, back in 1977, explicitly recommended excluding women who could potentially become pregnant from those early-phase clinical trials.
Wow. So one tragedy really just reshaped everything. The intent was protection, sure, but the unintended result was this massive blind spot, right? What did that lack of data actually mean for patients day to day?
Exactly right. A blind spot. And think about the scale.
Yeah.
Over 200 million women get pregnant each year globally. In high-income countries, something like 80% are prescribed medication during pregnancy. And that doesn't even count over-the-counter stuff. But medication use in pregnancy, critically understudied. There just wasn't any legal or regulatory push to test new drugs specifically for this group.
So this information vacuum meant doctors and patients were, like you said, flying blind, making really critical health decisions without solid evidence. What does that actually look like in the real world? For you, maybe as a patient or talking to your doctor.
It put people in incredibly tough spots. The consequences, they can be really significant. People might avoid treatment they actually need, or they might stop treatment, leading to their condition getting worse when it could have been managed.
Or the opposite, maybe, taking something risky without knowing.
Or conversely, yes, inadvertently choosing treatments that could be harmful, simply because there's no better data or guidance. It also means maybe using a dose that's too low to work properly or too high, causing side effects. Even things like stopping breastfeeding early because of uncertainty about a medication's safety. That's been a common and really tough outcome. The public health impact, honestly, it's been considerable.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting and frankly hopeful. We're seeing this massive global effort now to fix this. Tell us about this new guideline that sounds like it could change everything.
This is genuinely groundbreaking. The European Medicines Agency, the EMA, has been working with global regulators, drug developers, through the International Council for Harmonization, let's just call it ICH. They've published a draft guideline, ICH E21. It's currently open for public consultation, actually, until September 2025. And it marks a monumental shift in how medicines are developed for pregnant and breastfeeding people. Even Swissmedic in Switzerland has launched their own consultation on it. It shows how global this is.
So not just one region, but a coordinated global push. What's the sort of core principle? What's the really big change here?
The truly big change is that it flips the script. Instead of these populations being an afterthought, or worse, automatically excluded, they're now meant to be central to drug development planning, right from the start.
Yeah.
The core principle is that including pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in trials should be considered for basically all products where people who could become pregnant might use them. The goal: generate solid clinical data, allow for actual evidence-based decisions about safe and effective use. It really is a paradigm shift.
That's a powerful reframing. Moving from like exclusion equals protection to knowledge equals protection. How do we make that ethical jump, considering why they were excluded before?
Well, the guideline explicitly states that inclusion is ethical and necessary. It's backed by foundational documents like the Declaration of Helsinki, which guides human research ethics. What's interesting is seeing how thinking has shifted over years. Back in 2016, CIMs, the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, said pregnant women shouldn't be seen as vulnerable just because they're pregnant. And even the US HHS, their Office for Human Research Protection, removed pregnant women as an explicit example of a vulnerable group in 2019.
Ah, okay. So it reflects a wider understanding that real protection comes from data, from being informed, not just from being left out.
Precisely. Exclusion leaves people in the dark. Data empowers informed choices. So how does this actually work in practice? This new guideline, it gives a really comprehensive framework. It emphasizes that thinking about use in pregnancy and breastfeeding needs to happen throughout the entire drug development process. From the earliest non-clinical studies, the animal studies, all the way through to after the drug is approved and being used. A full life cycle approach. A recent review actually highlighted 4 main areas that these kinds of guidance documents focus on now for pregnancy safety.
So it's not just about getting people into trials later on. It sounds more fundamental, like changing how drugs are even thought about and developed from day one. A holistic strategy.
Exactly. Holistic is the right word. It starts with proactive planning. Developers are encouraged, strongly encouraged, to talk to regulators like the EMA or FDA early on. Key things to consider include the disease itself. What causes it? How does it show up? How common is it in women who might become pregnant? Like if a disease is rare in this group, the plan would look very different than for, say, a drug to treat anxiety or depression, which are common. Makes sense. And beyond the disease, what about the medicine itself? Does its specific nature matter? Oh, absolutely crucial. The medication's characteristics, how it works, its mechanism of action, how it moves through the body, its pharmacokinetics or PK and potential side effects, and the physiological changes during pregnancy. They can significantly alter that PK, how a drug is absorbed, distributed, broken down, eliminated. It all changes.
Right, because the body is just undergoing massive shifts.
Totally. So understanding these PK differences is vital. Often means the dose needs adjusting. And before human trials, you need those non-clinical studies, animal reproductive toxicology, genotoxicity tests to check for potential harm to the fetus first.
And are there times when getting this data early is especially critical, like situations where you just can't wait?
Yes, definitely. The guideline highlights situations of high medical need. Public health emergencies, think pandemics, or diseases that cause serious harm if untreated during pregnancy, severe autoimmune diseases, HIV maybe, or conditions where the current treatments aren't great or carry high risks themselves. In those cases, early data is a priority. Then, moving into the actual clinical trials, enrolling pregnant individuals, it's still complex, of course. There are potential risks. Decisions have to be based on a really careful individual risk-benefit calculation, considering the disease, the non-clinical data, any existing clinical data we have.
And who's guiding these specialized trials? It sounds like you'd need very specific expertise.
You absolutely do. The guideline strongly recommends consulting specialists, obstetricians, maternal fetal medicine specialists, neonatologists, pediatricians, both for designing the study and for ongoing safety monitoring. Their input is vital.
Okay, beyond the experts, what about the practical side? Like, how do you figure out the right dose when someone's body is changing so much? And how do you really know the effect on the baby?
Good questions. Collecting that PK data, how the drug moves through the body throughout different trimesters and even postpartum, is critical for dose adjustments. Modeling can help too. Things like physiologically based pharmacokinetics, PBPK modeling.
PBPK.
Yeah, think of it like creating a computer simulation, a sort of digital twin, to predict how a drug might behave in a pregnant person's body. It can help estimate dosing, even fetal exposure, which is obviously hard to measure directly. For outcomes, the goal is the same efficacy and safety measures as the general population, but importantly, adding specific pregnancy and infant assessments.
And how long do they track the child's outcomes? Because some effects might not show up right away, I imagine.
That's a key point. Follow-up duration is case by case, but it's recognized that long-term follow-up might be needed. Some birth defects or neurodevelopmental issues might not become apparent until later in childhood. So using things like existing pregnancy registries is encouraged to track these outcomes over time. And another crucial practical point, what happens if someone gets pregnant unexpectedly during a trial where contraception was required? The protocols now need options, maybe pausing the drug during pregnancy, or sometimes continuing treatment, but only after getting new informed consent, and ensuring extra data is collected with clear rules about who knows if the person is getting the drug or placebo.
So the data collection definitely doesn't stop when the medicine gets approved. It sounds like a commitment for the drug's entire lifespan.
Absolutely not. Post-approval data is crucial, especially for catching rare side effects or delayed outcomes that wouldn't show up in smaller trials. The companies making the drugs, the marketing authorization holders or MAHs, they're required to collect as much pregnancy exposure info as they can through case reports, ongoing surveillance.
And how does that feed into managing risk for the public, keeping everyone safe?
Those risk management plans, RMPs, they now have to specifically talk about the likelihood of use in pregnancy, consider alternatives, contraception needs, and these non-interventional studies become really important. Things like pregnancy exposure registries, which are big in the U.S., or epidemiological studies using existing data like health records, insurance claims, which are more emphasized in the EU, basically learning from real-world use.
So real-world data is playing a much bigger role here.
A huge role. Real-world data, RWD, and the evidence derived from it, RWE, collected from health records, claims, databases, registries, it's becoming vital for assessing how drugs are actually used and their potential benefits or risks in these populations over the long term.
Okay, so after all this data, preclinical, clinical trials, real-world use, how does it all finally get to you, the patient, or your doctor in a way that's actually useful?
Through much better product labeling, comprehensive labeling, the guideline stresses watching for safety signals throughout the product's life and timely reporting to health authorities if there's any hint of teratogenic effects causing birth defects. Those regular safety reports drug companies submit, DS-EARs and PBR-EARs, they must now specifically include data on pregnant and breastfeeding individuals. They're considered a special exposure population.
So what kind of info will actually be on these new labels? Will they be clearer than the often vague warnings we used to see?
They should be far more robust and descriptive, moving away from just don't use unless necessary. They're expected to include recommended doses for pregnancy and breastfeeding, the drug's effects on the pregnancy itself, like miscarriage risk, how it might cross the placenta affect the fetus risk of malformations, potential long-term effects, and crucially, information about its presence and effects in breast milk and on the breastfed child. Plus, any side effects or withdrawal in the newborn, ways to minimize risk, and monitoring guidance for both mother and baby. The FDA's label rule since 2015, the PLLR, already pushed towards this clearer descriptive language. It's a big improvement.
This sounds like a huge positive shift, but also a massive amount of work. What are the practical challenges, especially for the people participating in these studies?
That's a really important consideration.
Well-
Recruitment and keeping people in studies is a big one. Pregnancy is a time when, family concerns, social factors can really influence participation, either pushing someone towards it or away from it. So the guideline recommends raising awareness, providing really clear, detailed information, engaging patient groups, disease registries, even community health pros like midwives early on in the design.
Meeting people where they are, and how do they make it less burdensome? Because participating in a trial while pregnant or breastfeeding sounds demanding.
They're recommending concrete steps, reducing study procedures if possible, minimizing sample amounts, less breast milk, less infant blood needed, providing practical support, breast pumps, maybe childcare during visits, using home health nurses so people don't have to travel as much, flexibility with visit times, accounting for things like morning sickness, even allowing pre-study milk for infants during study periods. It's about reducing the burden, understanding the reality of participants' lives.
That makes a huge difference. And informed consent must be incredibly detailed, right? Given the potential impact on both the individual and the fetus or infant.
Absolutely critical. The consent process has to be adapted. Clearly state if someone can stay in the trial if they become pregnant and under what conditions. You might need extra consent forms if someone is already pregnant or becomes pregnant during the study. It has to detail the potential benefits and risks for both the individual and the fetus or infant. Consent for long-term follow-up needs to be explicit, and it must always acknowledge that clinical care, the patient's health, takes priority over the study protocol. Always. Plus, people should be reconsented if new information comes up that changes that benefit-risk balance. Transparency and choice are paramount.
You mentioned breastfeeding as distinct. What are the unique things to consider there?
Right. The benefit-risk calculation is different than during pregnancy. The focus shifts to how much drug actually gets into the breast milk, how much might the infant absorb from that milk, and balancing that potential exposure against the known significant benefits of breastfeeding itself. So the guideline talks about specific lactation studies because it's different. Sometimes they might first do a study just looking at drug levels in the mother's milk, and she discards that milk. That could be a prerequisite before a study where the baby is exposed. Then you have mother-infant pair studies. That's where the infant is exposed via breastfeeding, and their health, growth, development are monitored very closely.
So it's getting really specific, granular data on transfer and impact, not just making assumptions based on, say, the pregnancy data.
Exactly, not just assumptions. These studies help figure out if the mother needs a different dose postpartum. They look at outcomes specifically for the infant well-being, growth, development over time.
Yeah.
They even consider if the drug affects lactation itself, like milk production. That's crucial for new mothers. And the guideline mentions practical support, like providing access to lactation consultants to help mothers keep expressing milk or breastfeeding during studies. It's these details that show a real commitment.
Wow. This deep dive really shows a monumental shift, doesn't it? Moving from that old stance of exclusion for protection, which paradoxically often meant less protection because of the knowledge gap, to this new approach of informed inclusion for better health outcomes for everyone involved.
It's a truly crucial step. It's about ensuring that this huge part of the population, people who frequently need and use medicines, finally have access to the specific evidence needed for safe, effective care. It's not just about the drugs themselves. It's about empowering patients, empowering healthcare providers with the knowledge they need to make the best possible decisions for maternal health, for infant health, moving from guesswork to guidance.
And what's really fascinating, thinking longer term, is how this comprehensive life cycle approach could maybe serve as a model for how we gather data for other groups that have historically been understudied in research. As you think about this evolving landscape, what questions does it spark for you? Maybe about how we define vulnerability in research moving forward, and how future guidelines might push for even more equitable access to evidence-based care truly for all populations.